The absolute worst part wasn't the dead silence in the cell, but the sound of something slamming against the plastic water bucket like an air raid siren. I jolted awake in the pitch dark. No one else moved. I looked over at the partition wall of the toilet, which was about 2 meters high with an open gap to the ceiling. 2 sickly pale hands were gripping the top edge. Then a bald, bone-white head bobbed up, moving exactly like someone doing pull-ups. I genuinely thought someone was just terrified of dying from COVID and was working out in the middle of the night. But then the guy hoisted himself completely onto the narrow ledge. He just squatted there like some messed up Spider-Man in an inmate uniform, with his knees splayed wide open. I was so confused I literally asked out loud what the heck he was doing up there. And that is when he started crawling straight up the concrete wall, entirely defying gravity, and scurried across the ceiling right over my head. I need to back up because this sounds insane. This all happened around mid-2021 when the pandemic hit. I was doing a 5-year stint for some dumb stuff I did back in 2019. Me and a few other guys caught COVID while wearing our masks and digging dirt out in the yard with heavy hose, so they packed us up to move us. The driver, who was wearing a full white hazmat suit, leaned out the window and flat out told us that if we stayed at our current camp, we would die, so they were taking us to the quarantine ward where they actually had meds. They locked us in the back of this suffocating sealed transport van for over an hour before we finally arrived at this incredibly old, notorious prison in the city center. They repurposed it as a quarantine ward. They didn't want the 7 of us starting gang fights between the old and new guys, so they divided us into 3 different isolated cells, putting us in groups of 2 or 3. They tossed me into a cell that had apparently been sealed shut for decades. It was a bleak setup. We had this grimy squatter toilet in the corner with 0 running water. We just had a single large barrel of water outside for over a dozen guys. We had a strict rule where you could only scoop half a small bucket at a time for absolutely everything, from flushing to showering, because hauling that water from the main source was an incredibly long, grueling walk across the compound. The first night I was there, I kept hearing loud splashes coming from the toilet hole, like someone dumping massive pitchers of water down the drain over and over. I was getting pretty pissed off, thinking someone was just messing around and wasting our rations. But when morning came, our water barrel was completely untouched. The guys in the cell basically told me I was losing my mind and to stop saying creepy stuff. The afternoon after that first weird night was just agonizingly slow. Because it was a quarantine ward right in the middle of Saigon, we didn't have any hard labor to do. We just sat around, taking our meds, doing nasal swabs, and occasionally kicking a makeshift ball around to pass the time. Since we had nothing but time to kill, the older guys in the cell started telling stories about the history of the prison. They told me that back in the day, this specific facility held some of the most ruthless crime bosses and gang leaders in the country. The prison hierarchy was brutal back then. They had this strict initiation rule for any new guy walking into a cell. The cell boss would ask the new guy if he knew how to sit. If you didn't immediately drop into a deep squat with your hands clasped behind your neck, you were beaten mercilessly. If you resisted at all, they would force you to hold that squatting position all night long, and if you fell over, they would beat you until you couldn't stand. Hearing all that made me incredibly relieved that I was doing my time in the modern era where things were strictly regulated and everyone just treated each other like equals. Right around late afternoon, the guards brought in a new guy from another camp who had just tested positive. His name was Caleb, or maybe it was Cody. I don't exactly remember, but he was this young kid, maybe 19 or 20 years old. He wore thick glasses and looked like he had never been in a fight in his life. He was in for some sort of cybercrime, completely out of his element. As soon as he walked in, the older guys decided to mess with him. They surrounded him, acting all tough, and aggressively asked him if he knew how to sit and if he knew who the cell boss was. Caleb looked absolutely terrified and immediately dropped into that exact deep squat on the floor. The whole room just burst out laughing. We grabbed him by the arms, pulled him back up, and told him we were just messing around and that there were no gang rules in here anymore. The kid finally breathed a sigh of relief, and everything went back to normal. That night, because I had barely slept the night before, I crashed pretty early, maybe around 10 p.m. They had assigned Caleb to sleep on a raised cement block that was right next to the entrance of the bathroom. It was probably the worst spot in the room because it was only half a meter away from the squatter toilet and it constantly reeked of stale piss, but he was the new guy, so he didn't complain. I don't know how long I was asleep, but I woke up again to the distinct heavy slosh of water hitting the porcelain drain. I opened my eyes, looking through the darkness toward the bathroom area. Right there, in the tiny gap between Caleb's cement bed and the toilet wall, I saw a dark silhouette. It was a person sitting in that exact punishment squat, with their knees pushed out and both hands firmly clamped behind their neck. I was so out of it, I just figured the older guys were actually hazing the new kid while the rest of us were asleep. I felt this surge of annoyance and called out into the dark, telling Caleb to just get up and go to sleep, because this hazing bullshit had to stop. The second I spoke, the figure silently stood up, but instead of getting into the bed, it took a sharp right turn and walked straight into the pitch-black bathroom. A couple of the guys near me stirred, asking me what I was yelling about. I told them that I woke up and saw Caleb getting punished near the bathroom door, but they just groaned, calling me an idiot and pointing straight at the cement block. I squinted in the dark and felt my stomach completely drop. Caleb was lying flat on his back on the cement block, tangled in his blanket, snoring softly. He had never moved. I just stared at his sleeping body, and then stared at the dark, empty doorway of the bathroom. I waited for whoever had walked in there to come out, but nobody ever did. I was so pumped full of heavy COVID medications that I honestly couldn't keep my eyes open, even though I was starting to get genuinely creeped out. I passed out again for what felt like an hour. Around 2 or maybe 3 a.m., I was violently jolted awake by a massive splash. It sounded like someone had taken a massive industrial bucket of water and hurled it straight down the toilet bowl. I bolted upright, instantly angry because I thought the floor was going to be flooded. I looked over, and that exact same silhouette was back. It was squatting in the exact same spot, in the exact same punishment pose, hands locked behind its neck. I looked up, and Caleb was still fast asleep on his bed. Holy shit. My stomach completely dropped, and all the blood just rushed out of my face. I didn't say a single word this time. I just sat frozen in the dark, watching this thing for maybe 10 agonizing seconds. It didn't make a sound. It didn't breathe. Then, slowly, it stood up and walked back into the bathroom. I didn't make a single sound, just slowly pulling my blanket up to my chin, while the entire room stayed dead quiet, desperately trying to convince myself I was just having a fever dream from the virus. I managed to close my eyes, and that brings me right back to the moment I told you about at the beginning. The deafening banging on the water bucket, the sickly pale hands gripping the top of the 2-meter partition wall, and that bone-white bald head pulling itself up, all happened in one fluid, silent motion that just completely paralyzed me. I was sitting cross-legged on my concrete bed, completely paralyzed, watching this impossibly pale figure in a prison uniform squat on the ledge like a predator. It scared the absolute crap out of me. When it started crawling vertically up the concrete wall, completely ignoring gravity, my brain just stopped functioning. It scurried upside down across the high ceiling, its limbs moving in this horrible, disjointed rhythm, right over my head. It crawled down the opposite wall, dropped silently onto the cement block near the sleeping kid, and slipped right back into the bathroom. Then it looped around and did it again. It just kept crawling in circles like it was putting on a sick, twisted performance, just for me. I rubbed my eyes repeatedly, thinking I had somehow been drugged. Right at that moment, the night guard walked by on his patrol. He saw me sitting up, my head tracking the ceiling like I was watching a tennis match. He slammed his heavy baton against the window bars, barking at me to lay down and go to sleep before the virus took me out. I practically scrambled off my bed, stammering and begging him to look at the ceiling, telling him there was a guy crawling up there. The guard shined his flashlight into the room, sweeping the beam across the empty ceiling and the quiet bathroom. He glared at me, calling me a crazy junkie, and threatened to throw me in solitary if I didn't shut up. I looked back, and the crawling figure was completely gone. My blood turned into absolute ice when I realized the truth. I was locked in a fucking cage with something that wasn't human, and nobody was going to help me. I threw myself back onto my bed, turned my face to the cold concrete wall, and for the first time in my life, I started aggressively praying. I had never been religious a day in my life, but I was literally crying out for my mom and dad like a terrified little kid. I just squeezed my eyes shut and started desperately muttering every sacred prayer I had ever heard, begging whatever higher power was out there to put a shield around me, just repeating those frantic pleas until my throat hurt. Just as I started to drift off, I heard the heavy splash of water from the toilet again. I refused to turn around. I kept my eyes squeezed shut until the sun finally came up. The next morning, I was a wreck. I told the entire room what I saw. Everyone was dead silent, looking at me with real fear in their eyes. That was when an older inmate, a guy in his 60s, finally spoke up. This older dude was basically a lifer, an old-timer who had been in and out of the system since before 1975. He was a career thief, doing 7 or 8 year stints at a time, snatching bags off people riding everything from old bicycles back in the day to modern Honda Waves and Dreams. He told us he was currently serving a massive 20-something year sentence because one of his snatch and grabs caused a victim to crash and suffer severe, life-threatening injuries. He told us that back in the late 80s, he was serving a long sentence right here in this specific prison block. He said the cell we were currently in used to be fully packed. One day, they brought in a new inmate who was incredibly stubborn. When the cell boss told him to squat, the guy flat out refused and just lay down on the floor. The gang beat him mercilessly for days, but he would not submit. They had to physically hold him down in a squatting position, kicking him in the ribs every time he twitched. The older inmate told us that one night, the cell boss got so furious that he grabbed a heavy plastic water pitcher from the bathroom. It was old and cracked, with jagged, sharp edges on the bottom. He used it to bash the stubborn guy repeatedly on the head, trying to force him into submission. One of the sharp plastic edges dug deep into the guy's scalp, splitting it open. It was late at night, and instead of letting him get medical help, the boss kicked him into the damp, freezing bathroom and told him to sleep on the wet tiles. By the time morning roll call happened, they dragged the guy out, and he was stiff as a board with rigor mortis, just left rotting like a piece of meat on the freezing wet tiles. He had died in the night. The boss was shipped off to a maximum security facility, but the nightmare didn't end there. Almost immediately after the death, guys in the cell started seeing things. Anyone who got up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night would see a dark figure squatting in the corner, or they would look up and see a pale, bald head dripping with blood peeking over the partition wall. People were screaming in the dark every single night. It got so bad that the guards eventually evacuated the entire cell, locked the heavy doors, and left it completely abandoned for decades. It stayed empty until the pandemic hit, and they were so desperate for quarantine space that they unsealed it and threw us right inside. For the next 5 days, I was trapped in that room. Every single evening, we would haul water to fill up the barrel, and every single night without fail, the heavy splashing would start in the pitch dark. It sounded so aggressive, so deliberate, like whatever was in that bathroom was just waiting for me to turn my head and look at it one more time. I never did. I just pressed my face so hard into the concrete wall and prayed until my chest hurt, waiting for the sun to come up. When my test finally came back negative, I packed my stuff, walked out of those gates, and I never looked back. I kicked the heavy wooden door so hard, I felt my heel bone grind against the socket, fully expecting to catch some punk hiding inside. The door smashed open against the filthy tiles. The stall was completely empty, but right there, perfectly balanced on the rim of the disgusting squat toilet, were 2 lit cigarettes. The ash was completely intact, hanging off the ends as long as my damn finger, and thin tendrils of smoke were lazily curling up toward the ceiling. You physically cannot reach your arm around from the outside to place them like that. Someone, or something, had to have taken them from my buddy's hand. I was a strictly raised Catholic back then, mixed up in a life of organized crime in the late 90s. Running underground gambling rings gave me a massive ego, so when I got locked up in a colonial-era prison, I didn't break a sweat. I wasn't a Mundarar by any means, but I caught an assault charge for beating a guy so badly he ended up with severe permanent injuries, which landed me a sentence of over 5 years. I was placed in Sector AB, the highest tier for guys with money and clout. I didn't have to break rocks or shovel dirt. I just sat around, smoking contraband cigarettes, preaching to my younger cellmates that ghosts were just hallucinations born from a weak mind. The setup in Sector AB was pretty laid back compared to the rest of the facility. I had a crew of younger guys who practically waited on me hand and foot because of my reputation on the streets of Saigon. One of them was this skinny, paranoid kid named Trent. He was completely terrified of his own shadow and constantly rambling about the prison being haunted. I always shut him down immediately. I used to lecture him, telling him that if he was so scared, he should start doing push-ups to build some muscle instead of whining. I told him straight up that the only ghosts in this world are the living ones, and that out in the criminal underworld, I had hidden in actual graveyards for days to dodge the cops and never saw a single ghost. I told him he was just weak and letting his mind play tricks on him. But then, things started getting weird. It was deep into the night, maybe around 2:14 a.m., or something close to that. A few of us were huddled by the bathrooms to sneak a smoke. The prison stalls had high walls, but no actual ceiling, so the smoke would just drift up into the rafters. Trent usually went to sleep early because he was too scared to be awake in the dark. But that night he crawled over to us, looking completely restless, and begged me for a cigarette. I tossed him one. He took a few drags and then immediately asked for another. I got pretty annoyed, asking him why he was wasting my stash when he literally had half a cigarette still burning in his hand. He nervously pointed at the closed stall door and whispered that some new guy was taking a dump in there and asked for a smoke to cover up the smell. I had been sitting there the whole time, and I swore I never saw anyone walk into that stall, but I didn't want to argue, so I lit another one and handed it to him. Trent crouched down and slid his arm through the wide gap at the bottom of the stall door, offering it to whoever was supposedly inside. I watched his hand go in, and it clearly looked like someone took it from his grip. A few minutes passed, and I noticed this incredibly thick, heavy cloud of smoke billowing up from the roofless stall. It wasn't just a cigarette burning idly. Someone was taking massive, deep drags. But the weirdest part was that I couldn't smell anything else. If someone was using that squalid toilet for that long, the stench would be unbearable. But all I smelled was cheap tobacco. About 10 minutes later, Trent tapped my knee and asked for another one, claiming the guy inside had tapped his shoulder for a second smoke. I rolled my eyes, but I handed him another cigarette, watching him slide it under the gap again. We were just about to wrap it up and go back to our beds when Trent nervously reached out to me again. He asked for yet another cigarette, claiming the guy inside still wasn't done and was asking for a third. That is when I got genuinely pissed off. I pointed out that Trent was sitting with his back against the door, and the door never even creaked open, so there was absolutely no physical way someone could have reached out and tapped his shoulder. I got up, fully prepared to drag whoever was in there out by their hair for being so greedy. I yanked on the handle, but it was jammed, so I leaned back and delivered a brutal flying kick right into the center of the wood, which leads back to what I told you at the beginning. The stall was completely empty, and those 2 lit cigarettes were just resting perfectly on the filthy porcelain. I dragged Trent into the stall by his collar, completely pissed, demanding to know how he pulled off this stupid magic trick to waste my cigarettes. He was practically in tears, swearing up and down that he physically couldn't have reached his arm backward at that angle to balance them perfectly on the rim. Deep down, I knew he was right, but my ego refused to accept it, so I just yelled at everyone to go to sleep. The very next morning, I swung my legs off the bed, planted my feet on the concrete floor, and my leg just gave out, The exact spot on the arch of my foot where I had kicked that door was swollen to the size of a water balloon, completely engorged with festering pus. The skin was stretched so incredibly tight and bruised that it looked like if you just tapped it with a needle, the whole infection would violently explode, and it felt like I had stomped barefoot on a rusted spike that drove straight up into my bone. For an entire week, I could barely walk. I had to hobble to the bathroom on my tiptoes, in absolute agony, dropping my cigarettes because my hands were trembling so much from the fever it caused. My cellmates kept begging me to light some incense and apologize to whatever was in that stall, but my stubborn pride refused. I just blamed it on an infection and moved on. Months later, I decided to appeal my sentence. The thing about this prison is, every time you try to fight your case and get sent back from court, they drop you down to a lower tier. So, I got stripped of my privileges and dumped into Sector BC. I went from being the apex predator to an absolute nobody. This block was full of hardened older inmates serving long sentences. They would only pull these games a day or two after family visitation and commissary day, when everyone was suddenly loaded with cash and supplies, acting like rich college kids at the start of the month. They would stay up late, gambling with these crude, hand-drawn playing cards made from scraps of paper and dry leaves. To keep the guards from seeing their hands, they would literally sit cross-legged and hide the cards right under their crotches while they played. Playing cards was a massive violation, so they needed someone to keep watch. I volunteered, hoping they would throw me a scrap of meat or an egg from their commissary stashes. It was freezing cold, probably around 3:17 a.m. I was standing by the barred window, looking out into the pitch-black courtyard. I asked the older guys for a smoke as payment for my guard duty. One of them tossed me a cigarette. I grabbed it, turned my back to the window to shield the flame, and struck a match. The exact second the paper caught fire, something swung out of the absolute darkness and slammed directly into my wrist. The impact sounded like a wet crack, sending a shockwave straight up to my shoulder. I couldn't feel my hand anymore. It just hung there, completely lifeless. I yelled out and stumbled backward, looking up at the window. Standing on the other side of the bars was a guard, but his uniform was completely wrong. It looked ancient. He was wearing this strange, flat-topped cap, pulled down so low I couldn't see his eyes, and he was holding a solid wooden baton. When he spoke, it made my stomach drop. "Go to sleep. What are you doing standing here?" His voice was incredibly guttural. He was speaking Vietnamese, but it carried this thick, unnatural foreign accent, sounding exactly like someone violently forcing the words out of their throat. I panicked and yelled to the guys that a guard was outside. They frantically hid their cards and pretended to sleep, but when they looked at the window, it was completely empty. I spent the rest of the night clutching my swollen purple wrist in agony. The next morning, I went to the infirmary to get it wrapped. The actual guards interrogated me, demanding to know who I was fighting with. I desperately tried to explain that an officer in an old uniform hit me through the bars. The guard's face instantly went pale, and he threatened to throw me in solitary confinement if I ever mentioned that description again. When I got back to the cell, the older inmates quietly explained that I had just met the French colonial officer. Apparently, decades ago, this prison was run by foreign military, and that specific guard still patrolled the perimeter. They told me I was incredibly unlucky to get hit by him, but I still tried to brush it off as a hallucination brought on by the cold. My stubbornness finally broke after my next appeal failed, and they threw me down into Sector CD. This was the absolute bottom of the barrel. Everyone here was destitute, forgotten by their families, and half-starved. The atmosphere was so suffocating and heavy that you could literally feel a pressure in your chest just breathing the air. The inmates had this strict, unspoken rule that if you had to get up for water at night, you always woke up 2 other guys to go with you. I thought it was ridiculous. One night, at the end of the month, the guards brought in a small table with a few pieces of roast duck and a box of chocolate cakes to do a spiritual offering. I mean, we were starving, and the smell of the chocolate and roasted meat literally made my mouth water. The other inmates told me I absolutely had to light incense and pray before eating, but I told them I was strictly Catholic and refused to pray to some wandering ghosts. So the second they finished, I just grabbed 3 or 4 whole chocopes and the duck meat and started eating without lighting a single stick of incense. The other guys looked at me like a total goner, warning me that I was being deeply disrespectful. But I just ignored them and swallowed the food whole. That night, my body paid the price. I just laid there on the hard floor, sweating profusely, completely unable to close my eyes. I felt this intense, crushing anxiety out of nowhere. I think it was close to 2 a.m. when I finally gave up trying to sleep. I had a tiny little stub of a cigarette hidden in my pocket, so I quietly slipped out of the crowded cell to get a few puffs in the hallway. I struck a match, cupped my hands, and took a deep drag. The second the smoke hit my lungs, I was staring right at the cherry of the cigarette when it flared up violently, and the entire thing burned straight down to the filter in one single, unnatural flash. It was like an invisible set of lungs had just inhaled the entire thing at once. Before I could even drop the burning filter, I heard a voice whisper right against the back of my neck. "Got any more, buddy? Just a few more drags. I am so effing cold." My chest tightened up so bad I forgot how to breathe. I slowly turned my head. Standing inches away from me in the dim hallway was a young guy about my age, but he wasn't wearing a prison uniform. He was in regular street clothes. His skin was the color of wet cement, and his lips were this horrifying bruised purple, looking exactly like a corpse that had been left in a freezer. He just kept stepping closer to me, his eyes locked on my empty hands, begging for another drag to warm him up. My throat just closed up. I tried to speak, but not a single sound came out. I just kept stumbling backward until I bumped into one of my cellmates, who had woken up to find me. When I blinked, the freezing guy in the street clothes was just gone. My cellmate dragged me back into the room and quietly explained everything. A few years ago, a guy in our block was finally finishing his sentence. The night before his release, the guards gave him back his civilian clothes to sleep in so he could leave first thing in the morning. But the dampness of the prison had given him a severe lung infection. He went to sleep shivering, dreaming of smoking a real cigarette outside the gates, and never woke up. The guards found him stiff as a board the next morning. His spirit was completely trapped in that hallway, constantly begging the living for the smoke he never got to have. The harassment got so bad with new inmates that the guards actually started setting up those monthly food offerings just to keep him pacified. That was the night my arrogance finally died. I spent the rest of my time in that sector religiously lighting incense and bowing my head every single night. But nothing could prepare me for the absolute hell of the lowest tier. My final appeal was rejected, and I was thrown into the darkest, most isolated wing of the entire prison while waiting to be transferred to a labor camp. The guys in this block were completely broken, losing their minds from the isolation. To entertain themselves, they would force this quiet, outcast kid named Declan to perform seances. Declan was incredibly vulnerable and constantly bullied, so he had no choice but to obey. They sat him on a metal bed in the pitch-black room, blindfolded him with a dirty rag, and told him to call upon Tessa. I didn't know who Tessa was, but the moment Declan started chanting her name, the temperature in the room plummeted. Declan's body suddenly snapped backward and started convulsing. Thick white foam started pouring out of his mouth, and dark blood trickled from his nose, soaking right through the black blindfold. Then, his entire posture shifted. It was so wicked unnatural. His spine contorted, and he began sitting and moving with this deeply disturbing, exaggerated feminine grace. Without any eyes, the thing controlling Declan slowly raised a trembling hand and pointed perfectly in the dark at different men in the room. In a voice that sounded like vocal cords tearing apart, the entity started exposing their most repulsive secrets. "Silas," it hissed, pointing a stiff finger directly at a guy shivering in the corner. "I see you jerking off in the toilet stall every single day." Then the hand snapped toward another inmate in the dark. "And Tristan, keeping all that commissary food hidden from your brothers." It even turned to a guy named Beckett, laughing sadistically about the disgusting things he was doing under the blanket next to Archer in the pitch black of night. Guys were literally trampling over each other to get out of the room, leaving Declan to suddenly collapse violently against the concrete floor, completely unconscious. Nobody helped him, so I rushed over and pulled him up. When he finally came to, he was weeping. He told me he grew up as a homeless orphan, sleeping rough near graveyards. which made him a literal magnet for the Eddie. The first night he got transferred to this block, he walked into the bathroom and saw a woman standing in the corner without a single stitch on. He was terrified and just stood there, practically begging her to spare him since he was just a miserable prisoner too. But because he was weak, she immediately used his body as a vessel. He told me that after that first possession, he started asking around and found out the dark history of this place. This specific block used to be the women's facility decades ago. It was built deep inside the facility, completely cut off and impossible to monitor without cameras. Tessa was a prisoner here, and the guards passed her around and kept her as nothing more than a personal toy. The trauma was so severe that she eventually bit completely through her own tongue to end her suffering. The wardens eventually swept the whole thing under the rug, moved the women away to a safer area, and turned this into a men's block. He told me through sobs that every single time she possessed him, it physically drained his body so badly he couldn't eat or stand for almost a week. But the second he recovered, the other inmates would beat him, until he agreed to call her back up to entertain them all over again. My appeals ran out, and I served my time in a hard labor camp before returning to the criminal underworld. I spent 10 more years as a boss before the guilt finally broke me. Now, I dedicate my life to the church, trying to repent for all the people I hurt. But no matter how many prayers I send up, it doesn't change the terrifying reality. That rotting prison is still standing. Tessa is still trapped in that pitch-black stall, reliving her nightmare every single night. And that freezing boy is still wandering the halls, begging for a smoke he's never going to get. It's their world. We were just locked in it with them. The heavy steel food slot at the bottom of my cell door wasn't just rattling, it was violently slamming up and down like a metal jaw chewing on nothing, creating this deafening metallic crashing noise that echoed in the tiny space. That flap was designed to be completely unopenable from the inside, heavily padlocked from the hallway, but right then at past 3 a.m., it was practically hyperventilating. I scrambled back on my concrete slab, unable to tear my eyes away from the gap every time the metal flap kicked up. Through that narrow slit, illuminated by the sick yellow security lights of the corridor, I saw a pair of black and white striped prison pants standing right outside my door. But the bottoms of the pants were just empty space. No boots, no bare feet. There was zero breeze blowing those pants. That heavy steel flap was violently bouncing up and down like there was a Category 5 hurricane trapped in the hallway, but the fabric of those legs was just hanging there, perfectly flat, completely stiff, just dead still, while the metal right next to it went absolutely psychotic. I'm in my 30s now, and honestly, I'm the most laid-back guy you'll ever meet. If someone screams in my face in traffic, I just smile and walk away. In fact, it was my wife who got totally hooked on these scary stories recently and kept aggressively pushing me to finally speak up and share what happened to me. Back in 2014, I was an arrogant 20-year-old punk with a massive chip on my shoulder. I got slapped with a measly 12-month sentence for nearly beating a guy to a bloody pulp and shattering his face in a street fight, which basically made me fresh meat for the lifers and the 10-year guys who hated anyone with a short stint. They constantly provoked me, trying to get me to snap so the guards would tack on another year or two. I actually managed to bite my tongue and endure their crap for about 2 or 3 months. My family even came up to visit and practically begged me to just keep my head down, warning me that the veterans were just trying to bait me into getting my sentence extended to 1.5 years or 2 years. I knew they were right, but the older guys fought incredibly dirty, using these vile, underhanded tactics every single day, and like a total idiot, I finally lost my cool and got into another brawl. I didn't shatter any bones this time around or put anyone in the hospital, but the prison system didn't care. They used that minor scuffle as an absolute excuse to throw the book at me. That little stunt earned me a one-way ticket to the maximum security isolation block. I remember walking down that dreary corridor with a dozen dead-end cells, and when the guard smugly announced I was going into cell 5, The entire block erupted into this echoing, sinister laughter. Some unseen guy down the hall started yelling out to have a good night's sleep, while others who were a bit more decent just looked at me through their slots and shook their heads in pure pity. This shoved me inside, and the heavy steel door slammed shut behind me with a sickening thud that vibrated right through my teeth. The space was an absolute joke. It was a solid concrete box, maybe 4 feet wide at best, with nothing but a raised cement slab for a bed, a paper-thin woven mat, and a completely exposed metal toilet shoved into the corner. There were no bars on the door, just a solid slab of cold gray steel with a tiny reinforced glass peephole way up near the ceiling so the staff could check on you, and that heavy metal food tray slot down by the floor. The terrifying thing about that specific door design was that when the steel flap was locked, the cell became a 100% blind box. You couldn't see a single sliver of the hallway. The only possible way to look out into the corridor was if someone on the other side physically unlatched and lifted that heavy metal flap. The air inside felt incredibly stale, smelling like old sweat and bleach, and the heat was just oppressive. I sat down on the hard slab and tried to act tough, telling myself that I only had 10 days in this hole and I could do it standing on my head. Around 6:14 p.m., I heard the distinct sound of heavy tactical boots stomping down the concrete hallway. Before he even got to my door, I could clearly hear him stopping at the other isolation cells, casually talking to the guys. I heard his voice vividly, encouraging someone down the hall, telling them they were getting released back to the regular block tomorrow and to make sure they stayed out of trouble. It was incredibly grounding to hear a normal human interaction, confirming it was just the evening shift corrections officer doing his rounds. Then, I heard a loud, wooden thud right against my door, like a baton hitting the steel. I crouched down near the food slot to hear him better, as he asked me why a young kid like me was getting thrown into the maximum penalty block. He didn't have my file, and he had absolutely no idea what my original charge was or who I was. He was literally just asking out of pure curiosity, because I looked completely out of place. I desperately tried to explain my side of the story, telling him that the older guys were constantly harassing me and trying to bait me into a fight just because I had a short sentence. The guard let out a heavy sigh and told me that the veterans despised my short time and would do absolutely anything to make sure I caught a new charge, and stayed locked up with them, so I really needed to smarten up and keep my head down. He sounded genuinely tired, but sympathetic, and after that, I just heard his boots walking away down the corridor. The real nightmare started when the lights in the main cell block got dimmed. I was lying on the concrete slab, completely miserable because the guards had shackled my right ankle to a heavy iron ring bolted to the wall. The metal cuff was biting aggressively into my skin, cutting off the circulation, so my leg was throbbing and going completely numb. On top of that, the isolation wing was swarming with mosquitoes, and the constant high-pitched buzzing near my ears was driving me absolutely insane. I was just tossing and turning, sweating through my thin uniform, rubbing the swollen bites on my arms, and trying to ignore the shooting cramps in my leg. Sometime around 11:42 p.m., or maybe it was closer to midnight, I heard a sharp tapping noise echoing through my cell. It wasn't the heavy strike of a wooden baton. It was a very distinct, rhythmic sound of bare knuckles producing this slow, agonizingly deliberate knocking rhythm against the solid steel door that made me freeze instantly on my mat. A voice spoke from the hallway, filtering through the tiny gaps in the door frame. It was incredibly deep, raspy, and sounded completely hollow. "Why are you in the special isolation block?" I frowned in the dark. I figured it was just the night shift guard doing a welfare check, so I leaned over and gave him the exact same excuse I gave the earlier officer, explaining how I was set up by the guys in the general population. The deep voice responded immediately. "You are serving 12 months, and they hate you. They will keep pushing you until you catch a new charge, so you need to smarten up, kid." I just sat there blinking in the pitch black. The words were identical. It wasn't just a similar warning. It was the exact same script, word for word, matched perfectly to the syllables the evening guard had used, but delivered in this slow, robotic monotone. It sounded exactly like Google Translate or some cheap AI text-to-speech program. just reading off a script. It was blindly echoing the exact conversation I literally just had with a guard who didn't even know my actual file. I tried to gaslight myself, aggressively rubbing my tired eyes and rationalizing that the guards probably just shared notes on the inmates and used the same psychological tactics to mess with the guys in solitary. It was just a stupid hazing ritual, a bunch of crap designed to break my ego. I laid back down, ignoring the throbbing pain in my shackled ankle, and forced myself to close my eyes. The air in the cell grew incredibly cold. I don't mean a slight draft. I mean a deep, unnatural chill that made the sweat freeze on the back of my neck. I was drifting in and out of a miserable half-sleep when the knocking returned. I glanced at the sliver of light under my door, guessing it was somewhere around 1:38 a.m. That same deliberate, hollow, knuckle-knocking rhythm vibrated right through the heavy metal. "Why are you in the special isolation block?" My heart started beating a little faster. I was incredibly pissed off and exhausted, so I completely ignored it. I didn't say a single word. I just held my breath, waiting for whoever was out there to get bored and walk away. But the silence stretched out. The voice waited for the exact amount of time it took me to answer during the first visit, counting the silent seconds perfectly, and then it spoke again. "You are serving 12 months and they hate you. They will keep pushing you until you catch a new charge. So you need to smarten up, kid." I just pulled my knees up to my chest, dragging the heavy chain attached to my ankle. No human being operates like that. It completely ignored my silence, waiting the exact amount of seconds, and just forced its lines out into the empty hallway like a corrupted audio file. I just prayed for the sun to come up, but then 3 a.m. rolled around, leading right into the moment that completely broke my brain. I was staring blankly at the ceiling when the heavy steel food slot at the bottom of my cell door suddenly exploded. It was violently slamming up and down like a metal jaw chewing on nothing, creating this deafening metallic crashing noise that physically hurt my ears. The mechanical deadbolt on the outside of that flap was supposedly impenetrable, but it was just bouncing wildly on its hinges, like there was a Category 5 hurricane trapped in the hallway. I scrambled back against the far wall of my concrete slab, my breath catching in my throat, unable to tear my eyes away from the gap every time the metal flap kicked up. Through that narrow slit, illuminated by the sick yellow security lights of the corridor, I saw a pair of black and white striped prison pants standing right outside my door. But the bottoms of the pants were just empty space. No boots, no bare feet. There was no wind, no movement. They were just standing perfectly straight up like two hollow pillars, dead still, while the steel lock directly beneath them kept jumping and smashing against the frame. "Holy fucking shtay," I whispered, dragging the thin woven mat over my head, trembling so violently that my teeth were chattering together. I didn't know any actual prayers back then, so I just squeezed my eyes shut and started desperately whispering the name of Buddha over and over again, begging the universe to make it stop. Over the deafening sound of the crashing metal, that deep, hollow voice boomed from the hallway, carrying right through the open slot. "Why are you in the special isolation block?" I was crying under my blanket, biting my own lips so hard I tasted copper, absolutely refusing to make a sound. The voice waited for the exact calculated pause, completely indifferent to whether I answered or not. "You are serving 12 months, and they hate you. They will keep pushing you until you catch a new charge. So you need to smarten up, kid." And then, just like that, the heavy metal flap slammed down one final time. I heard the distinct, heavy metallic clack of the deadbolt sliding perfectly into place all by itself. The hallway went completely dead silent. I stayed hidden under my blanket for what felt like hours, too paralyzed to even shift my weight. When I finally found the courage to crawl over to the door, I pressed my trembling hands against the food slot and pushed with all my remaining strength. It was solid like a brick wall. The lock was fully engaged from the outside. The lock hadn't failed. It wasn't broken. Whatever was out there just manually popped that heavy deadbolt open for the sole purpose of making me look at those empty floating legs. It just wanted me to know exactly what I was locked in there with. At 6 a.m., the morning shift guards marched down the hall, violently banging their batons against every single door to wake everyone up. The guard hammered on my steel door and shouted for me to get up, mocking me by saying that I wasn't allowed to sleep during the day and that I was only allowed to sleep at night. So that was my reality. The guards were actively keeping me awake all day, and whatever was wearing those striped pants made damn sure I couldn't close my eyes at night. I was physically drained, my eyes burning from the lack of sleep, and my mind completely shattered. When the guards left, one of the guys in the adjacent cell actually called out to me first, casually asking how I slept. I was so shaken up that I just spilled everything to him through the solid walls, telling him about the voice, the tapping, and the floating pants. He just let out a dry, raspy laugh that sent chills down my spine, telling me that I was only on day 1 and I better buckle up because 10 days was actually a light punishment, considering he had been in there for a month. He told me that room 5 was legendary, and whatever was in there did not like sharing its space. That was just the first night. I had 9 more to go, and for the next 9 days it was a constant grueling cycle of absolute psychological torture. The day shift guards banged on my door to keep me awake all day, and every single night, without fail, that robotic footless entity visited my door 3 separate times, doing the exact same knuckle tapping and reciting the exact same script, 30 times in total. I stopped answering. I stopped reacting. I just sat in the dark, shivering in the oppressive heat, letting it consume whatever energy I had left. I literally felt like my brain was melting out of my ears from the sheer exhaustion. By the time my 10 days were up, they pulled me out of that concrete coffin looking like an absolute skeleton. Because the prison administration is always terrified of inmates catching something and dying in the isolation block, the medical staff actually came straight down to my cell with their equipment to do a mandatory evaluation right on the spot. They made me step onto their portable scale right in the hallway, and the dial just plummeted. I went in weighing around 120 pounds, but I stepped off that scale weighing barely 90. I had lost roughly 22 pounds in a week and a half. My skin was this sickly, translucent gray, and my eyes were completely hollowed out from severe sleep deprivation. The guards didn't let me sleep when the sun was up, and whatever owned cell 5 made damn sure I didn't sleep when it went down. It didn't even try to touch me. It just stood there, playing its broken little recording over and over again for 10 straight nights. I spent the rest of my sentence completely dead inside. I would literally sit in the yard and let the other guys stomp on my ribs, spit in my direction, and beat the absolute crap out of me, desperately trying to get a reaction, and I wouldn't lift a single finger to defend myself. I just laid on the concrete like a rock, swallowing my pride. Because I was so stubbornly unresponsive, those bullies actually got completely bored after a month or 2 and just stopped messing with me altogether. Thanks to that absolute terror, I finished my exact 12-month sentence and walked out a free man, not serving a single day more or less. I knew the alternative was catching a new charge and going back into its territory. There was always this dark rumor floating around the yard that some inmate had been thrown into cell 5 for special discipline, caught some severe illness, and just dead right there on that concrete slab. Whatever dead in that room is still there, knocking on that solid steel door every single night. I whipped around, gripping my heavy flashlight so hard my knuckles were turning white. Sitting right there on my narrow cot, just a few feet away, was an inmate in full stripes. His bare feet were casually dangling off the edge, head bobbing to this catchy pop tune he was whistling perfectly. The absolute worst part? I personally watched this guy cough up his lungs and pass away in solitary confinement a whole year ago. But let me back up. I used to be a shift supervisor at this massive, heavy-duty correctional facility just outside the city limits. It was just another mind-numbing graveyard shift, and I was locked inside my tiny 15-square-foot office, buried under a pile of inmate evaluation forms. To really understand how screwed up this whole situation was, you need to know a bit about the guy sitting on my bed. Back in 2008, He was actually a fairly well-known pop singer on the outside. Not an A-lister by any means, but he was definitely a solid B-list celebrity who made decent money. He drove this flashy two-door sports car and lived a pretty fast-paced lifestyle. The problem was, he had some severe underlying health issues, specifically liver disease and early-stage tuberculosis. One night he got way too drunk, got behind the wheel of that sports car, and caused a horrific accident that took a life. The judge threw the book at him, and he got slapped with something like an 8 or 10-year sentence. When he first got to our facility, he was actually a model inmate. He was polite, he kept his head down, and he used his musical talents to perform at all the little prison events we held during the holidays. He was just trying to rack up enough good behavior points to get his sentence reduced so he could get back to his life. I actually liked the guy. But prison environments are absolutely brutal on the human body. By mid-2009, his liver and lung conditions rapidly deteriorated. Because tuberculosis is highly contagious, the warden ordered him to be completely isolated from the general population. They threw him into this special solitary confinement cell, basically a concrete quarantine box, where he stayed for about 4 months, until his body just completely gave out. He was a devout Catholic, so after he passed, his family and his local church took custody of his remains and buried him at the Bin Hung Hoa Cemetery. That really should have been the end of his story. Fast forward, an entire year later. It was roughly 1:17 a.m., and I was pulling another solitary night shift. My office was this claustrophobic little concrete cube, located right next to the pre-release block. That specific block was reserved for inmates who only had a few months left on their sentences, so we kept them separate from the lifers. See, there is a sick, unspoken jungle law in prison. Guys with heavy sentences who have absolutely nothing to lose will actively try to pick fights with the short-timers out of pure spite, just to get them written up and ruin their parole. Because of that, the guys in this pre-release block were practically walking on eggshells. They were absolutely terrified of making even the slightest mistake. I was just sitting there under the buzzing fluorescent lights, exhausted, and trying to push through a mountain of paperwork, when I heard it. It was a whistling sound. It was faint at first, but it was incredibly clear, whistling the exact melody of a massive pop hit from back in the day. It annoyed the crap out of me because the prison at night is supposed to be pin-drop quiet. I immediately assumed it was one of the short-timers in the adjacent block feeling cocky and messing around. I stood up and yelled through the walls, swearing that if I found out who was whistling and fucking with me in the middle of the night, I would absolutely dock their points and ruin their chances of going home. I sat back down, fully expecting the silence to return. Instead, the whistling got louder. It didn't just get louder, it changed texture, sounding less like a human mouth and more like someone blowing directly into a wooden flute with this eerie, echoing resonance. I was getting seriously pissed at this point. I grabbed my heavy metal baton, marched right out of my office, and walked over to the bars of the pre-release block. I slammed my baton against the iron bars and aggressively demanded to know which one of those little punks was trying to be funny, asking if they thought I was deaf or something. The inmates completely panicked. There were over a dozen of them crammed together on those hard wooden bunks, and they frantically swore up and down that every single one of them had been knocked out cold. They practically begged me, swearing that with 15 guys stacked in one room, somebody would have heard something if they were messing around, and they wouldn't dare jeopardize their release dates over a stupid prank. I stood there looking at their terrified faces, and that is when a horrible realization washed over me. The whistling wasn't echoing from their cell block. I could still hear it perfectly. It was echoing from behind me. It was coming from inside my locked, windowless office. My stomach just completely dropped out of my body. I gripped my baton tighter and jogged back down the dim hallway. As I passed the small, reinforced window of my office door, I glanced inside, and my blood ran freezing cold. Standing entirely in the shadows, tucked into the tight corner right next to my tall metal filing cabinets, was a person wearing full striped prison scrubs. I could only see the silhouette, but they were just standing there in the pitch black. My chest was pounding so hard I thought I was going to throw up. I shoved my key into the lock, threw the door open, and burst inside ready to swing. The room was completely empty. I stood there breathing heavy, checking behind the door and under the desk. There was absolutely nothing. I tried to gaslight myself, convincing my brain that the exhaustion was finally getting to me and causing visual hallucinations. I sat back down at my desk, rubbing my eyes and trying to force my heart rate back to normal. Then, the air in my cramped little office suddenly plummeted in temperature. An unnatural gust of wind blew right across my desk in a room that had absolutely no ventilation. The thick manila folder I had been working on suddenly flipped violently open, the heavy paper pages rustling and scraping together with this loud, dry sound that made my skin crawl. I panicked and slammed my hand down flat on the open folder to stop the pages from flying everywhere. When I slowly lifted my hand, my eyes locked onto the document staring back at me. It was an inmate evaluation form. Pinned to the top right corner was a standard mugshot. I squinted under the harsh desk lamp and recognized the face immediately. It was the pop singer. I scanned the name and the charges, my brain struggling to process the information. I literally muttered out loud that this was impossible because the guy had died of tuberculosis a year ago. I quickly slammed the folder shut, shoved it to the far corner of my desk, and convinced myself it was just a bureaucratic error mixed in with the active files. Later that night, I finally laid down on my narrow cot to catch a quick nap. I ended up having this completely messed up dream that felt way too real. In the dream, I was just doing my normal patrol routine, walking down the cold concrete corridors, when I bumped into the singer. Somehow, my brain just completely glossed over the fact that he was deceased. I just treated him like a regular inmate. I told him he was doing a great job with his behavior, and I even complimented him on how good his singing was at the prison events. I told him it was an absolute shame that a talent like his was locked up in here, but if he kept his head down and did his 6 years, he'd be back out in the world in no time. He didn't look happy. He was squatting on the dirty floor, looking completely hollowed out and miserable. He looked right at me with these incredibly sad eyes. I can't go home. I need a priest to come inside and call me back, or I can never leave. I brushed him off, explaining that the legal system doesn't care about religious rights and that no priest has the authority to just walk into a state penitentiary and override a warden's sentence. I told him he just had to wait out his time, like everyone else. He started crying, wiping his face with his striped sleeves. "You don't understand, boss. I'm trapped. I need a priest to do the rites. Please." I jolted awake so hard, I nearly fell off my cot. I checked my watch, and it was around 3:42 a.m. My uniform was completely drenched in cold sweat. I sat up, rubbing my face, and then it hit me like a ton of bricks. Holy shest, he was Dad. I sat there completely frozen, wondering why the hell I was just having a full-blown conversation with him. That was when the wind blew again. It was stronger this time, sweeping through the locked room and violently flipping that same manila folder open. I practically lunged across the desk and slapped my hand down on the pages. I pulled the folder closer to my face. It was his exact file again, but this time my eyes focused on the large red ink stamped across the bottom of the page. It clearly stated his date of death, the official transfer of his remains to his church, and his final burial plot at Bin Hung Ho. I just sat there, paralyzed, my hand trembling on the paper. I was a seasoned correctional officer. I had seen plenty of inmates leave this place in body bags over the years, but I had never, ever entertained the idea that ghosts were real. I was sitting completely alone in a 15-square-foot box, realizing that the supernatural was entirely real, and it was currently in the room with me. And then, right behind my chair, the whistling started again. It was so close I could physically feel the vibration of the sound in the air. Every single hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood straight up. I reached for my baton with a shaking hand, my mind screaming at me to just run out the door. But then my ego kicked in. I told myself I was a sworn state officer, a guy with actual rank, and there was no way in hell I was going to let myself cower in my own prison. I swallowed the massive lump in my throat, gripped the heavy metal handle, and slowly spun around in my chair. Sitting right there on my narrow cot, just a few feet away, was the singer in full stripes. His bare feet were casually dangling off the edge. head bobbing to that catchy pop tune he was whistling perfectly. He wasn't even looking at me. He was just staring blankly straight ahead at the wall, completely hollowed out. It was just this quiet, unnatural indifference that made my blood freeze. My throat completely closed up. I couldn't even force myself to blink. My brain completely shattered trying to process a dead body, casually chilling in my workspace. I was terrified, but I knew I couldn't scream. If I started screaming at a ghost, the inmates next door would hear me, the other guards would hear me, and my career would be instantly over. I forced myself to take a deep, shaky breath and spoke to him in a quiet, trembling whisper. I told him that his sentence was over, that his debts were paid, and that he needed to stop haunting this place and just go home to his family. The moment I said that, he stopped whistling. He slumped his shoulders forward and started sobbing. He just buried his face in his hands, choking on these heavy, suffocating gasps that bounced off the tight concrete walls, making my tiny office feel like it was closing in on us. He stared at the concrete floor as the tears streamed down his gray face. "Boss, please, invite my priest inside. Tell him to take me home. I can't leave without him." He didn't fade away like in the movies. 1 second he was sitting right there, heavily depressing the mattress, and the blink of an eye later, the bed was empty. I kept the entire incident a secret. Prison politics are a nightmare, and showing any sign of mental weakness or talking about ghosts is a guaranteed way to get yourself pushed out of a job. But I couldn't ignore what he asked me to do. A few days later, during my shift, I quietly walked down to that exact solitary confinement cell where he had passed away. I stood right outside the heavy iron door, making sure the corridor was completely empty, and I just whispered into the darkness. I told him to hang on, that I was going to find a way to help him, but he had to be patient because getting a priest inside wasn't exactly easy. A few months rolled by, and the prison was gearing up to host a holiday festival for the inmates. We usually allowed various religious figures to come inside and host small prayer sessions for the prisoners. I used this opportunity to track down the exact priest from the singer's old neighborhood church. I drove to the parish on my day off and practically begged the guy to help me. I told him I needed him to ditch the main event and sneak away with me during the lunch break to do a private ritual in the quarantine block for a soul that was stuck. The priest was incredibly understanding. When the day of the festival arrived, we had to put on a little show. The priest pretended to get severe heat stroke from the midday sun, complaining he needed to step away from the crowd to rest. If anyone asked, I was just escorting him around for some fresh air. We sneaked down into the heavy security solitary confinement block where the singer had died. I stood watch by the heavy iron door while the priest spent a good chunk of time whispering prayers, splashing holy water, and conducting whatever rites were necessary to guide a lost soul out of that dark place. After I escorted the priest back to his car and made sure he was off the premises, I actually walked right back down to that solitary cell. I stood in front of the door one last time and whispered that my mission was done. I told him I didn't know if he was still lingering around to hear me, but if he was, he needed to just go home and find peace. I honestly felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders, thinking I had finally put the whole terrifying ordeal to rest. A few weeks later, I was cleaning off my desk and doing some routine file management. I remembered the singer's evaluation folder that had flipped open on my desk that terrifying night, and I figured I should probably hand it over to the archives department since the ordeal was finally over. I tore my office apart looking for it, but the manila folder was completely gone. I ran up to the main administration office and asked the records manager to pull up the singer's file so I could figure out where it went. The manager looked at me like I was completely out of my mind. He told me I had personally handed him that exact file to archive almost 2 years ago, right after the guy died. There was no file on my desk that night. There was no photo. It was all him. He knew I was just a desk jockey, a guy who didn't patrol the blocks and only paid attention to documents. So he manipulated the exact thing I stared at every single night, my paperwork, forcing me to see what I needed to see so I'd get him out. Ever since that day, I don't mess around anymore. Whenever an inmate drops dead on my watch, I don't care about the rules. While the coroner is zipping up the bag, I'm already on the phone, sneaking a priest or a monk through the back doors. I pay them out of my own pocket to do the rites right there on the concrete. Because I know now that the concrete walls and the iron bars aren't just designed to keep the living in. This whole place was built on some heavy, dark shast. The concrete itself is basically a giant trap designed to crush the violent energy of the guys locked inside. But it creates a vacuum. It traps whatever is left behind, too. If you die in here, your soul doesn't just cross over. It gets pinned to the concrete, serving an eternal sentence, unless someone alive physically opens the door for you.